Welcome to another episode of Licensed RPGs, and in this episode we're going to be taking a look at a far more recent title in the form of One Piece Romance Dawn. A title originally released for the PSP in Japan in December of 2013 and ported over to the 3DS in August of 2013. The port would eventually see a wide release in Europe and North America in the following months. Albeit the game managed to reach Europe first for a change and was released in November of 2013, while the North American release was in February of 2014. With all that being said, is this game any good? The short answer is no. The long answer, sit down and let me tell you about it. Plot-wise, the game follows the events of the first half of the series, so it basically covers the events of Luffy leaving to become a pirate and accepting training from Rayleigh after the War of the Best at Marineford. And while I say it covers all those events, it also leaves out many events as well, making the game overall unkind to those not familiar with the work in question. Those glaring moves is the Sky Island arc, the arc where they introduce the other supernovas, and the Amazon Lily arc. While the game doesn't entirely ignore them, its short summaries leave out many details, such as this one. Though the game also starts some information overload at times and will spawn pages upon pages of dialogue for you to read into rather boring cutscenes that are filled with typos. Some of the typos are hilarious, while others are just depressing. It just leaves me wondering how quality transmission missed over a half dozen typos and grammatical mistakes that I came across, and I'm not even the best at detecting these sorts of issues. Another major issue with the game is that it skips over several boss fights and arcs that it does include, such as Usopp vs. Perona, or Chopper and I versus their respective members of CP9. And these are losses that are the second worst aspect of the plot in my opinion, since it strips these characters of a chance to shine, and they get so very few opportunities to begin with, especially in the early story arcs. Graphically and style-wise, the game is rather weak as well. The visuals are especially weak throughout most of the game, with many objects in the background obviously being flat shapes, such as the prisoners in the cells at Impel Down, and the sea of marines and pirates at Marineford. Though even if that was an issue, the game also recycles the same enemy sprites throughout the game. In fact, the base marines you'll encounter at the start of the game will look the same as the elite marines at Marineford. In fact, you can probably count the amount of unique regular enemies in this game with your fingers and toes rather easily, despite the fact that the game will run in excess of 40 hours if you visit all the optional dungeons as you unlock them. Though the real issue with the graphics comes in the form of the cutscenes, which come in three variations. The usual one is to place a still image on the screen and then have a framed portrait of a specific character laid over top of it and attach world bubbles to them. To add in mood, the game has them pulsate for anger and shake back and forth for joy. And I'll be blunt in saying that these visuals are boring and sheer amount of text thrown at you is a chore to read. The next type of cutscene, and use that term loosely is to lift clips directly from the anime itself. And I'll be blunt in saying that this is almost as lazy as the previous type, since the anime clips don't look anything like the in-game graphics are sort of jarring in an unbelievable fashion. And the final type of cutscene is to have a manga-like split on the screen using the in-game graphics where the characters will exchange dialogue during a short break in a fight. These scenes are among the most pointless in my opinion since they add rather little to the story and only serve to break up the pace of combat in most cases. Sound-wise, it intends to fall a bit short since it has a rather limited number of tracks and reuses them without mercy. I'm not trying to say a limited soundtrack can't work, but the tracks in this game are largely forgivable with a few exceptions and are overused over the course of the game because of its long runtime. About the only other thing I can say about the game sound-wise is that the voices are entirely in Japanese and the few places the game does use the voice actors, and those uses only come in the anime clips they chose to use, which only adds to how awkward they feel since otherwise the game has no sound when it's doing the cutscenes other than the background music. Though the worst aspect of this game has to be the gameplay itself. I'll be blunt in saying this game has some of the most boring and tedious combat I've yet to experience in the game, and this is coming from someone who is a fan of turn-based combat despite its lack of realism. Well, I guess I should start with the least offensive parts of the gameplay and work my way to the worst. So to start with, the game includes a lot of barrels and crates throughout the various dungeons, but unless you're in a story chapter, these breakable objects are completely empty. And even if you are in a story chapter, the barrels and crates only contain up to 100 berry. In other words, breaking the barrels and crates in this game are a complete waste of your time and best avoided. The next aspect to discuss is the lackluster level design in itself. All the stages in this game are composed of narrow hallways interwoven together to create simple maze-like structures. But there's only one way to advance through them, so you'll spend a lot of time either backtracking to find the exit, or backtracking to explore an area fully in order to find the various chests that contain maps, healing items, support items, or crafting items. All in all, level design is just boring since you're playing as pirates whose greatest strength is absolute freedom from rules and authority. You constantly find yourself restrained by the nature of the levels. In some cases, this restraint makes little sense, like when you're in the woods or on a sandy beach. Moving on next is just the crafting system itself. is entirely empty in terms of depth and basically boils down to combining specific items together to obtain a specific result. Because of this, you have very little control over what sorts of stats or abilities a crafted item will have. In fact, the entire crafting system just leaves me scratching my head, since any of the crafted items will be weaker than the stuff you can simply buy in the shops at any given point in time of this game. There are a few exceptions, but many of the items just aren't worth your time and effort to make. Though the worst aspect of this game has to be the combat itself, which bothers not about depth and so on, but is completely lacking in it. The start of the game introduces us to the penalty rings and action points. The penalty rings are rather simple in concept, but their impact on dial is highly limited because of how easy it is. If you stay within the yellow ring, you'll take 0 penalties for your next turn. If you exit the yellow ring, but stay within the red ring, you'll have to wait longer for your next turn. And if you exit the red ring, you'll have to wait even longer for your next turn and take a hit to your AP gain as well. The action points are used to perform actions such as using items and attacking your enemies. If you manage to land a successful hit on your enemy, you gain TP points, which can be spent to execute special attacks. The problem is that one of the early armors you can pick up is called a pirate bag, and automatically generates a percentage of your maximum TP at the start of each of your turns. This is an issue since many of the area effect attacks have a relatively low cost, so you'll find yourself easily able to blow through most enemy encounters with one character about a third of the way through the game. Which basically means any combat involving Luffy will quickly amount to hitting A, right shoulder, and then Y rather quickly for regular enemies. And if that wasn't bad enough, Zoro is also capable of this feat after a while as well. And the high rate of TP gain you get from using the pirate bag also makes most of the boss battles a total joke as well, since you'll easily be able to spam your best moves almost every turn. Well, after all that complaining, do I have any good things to say about this game? Well, yes, but their inclusion in no way makes up for all the other problems I've listed. The first plus is the game is rather lengthy if you visit all the various dungeons in the game, and while the combat and whatnot is boring, I'll consider having a large amount of meat on the bone a plus even if the overall game isn't that good. The only other positives for this game is that it allows you to play as Ace after you beat the main story mode, and that you can skip through the cutscenes by pressing the start button. To be brief, this game is just lackluster from start to finish for the most part. It suffers from bland and unchallenging combat, skips over iconic scenes, and leaves out important context for those unfamiliar with the franchise. All in all, this game is something that should just be skipped over unless you are a diehard fan of RPGs and have to own every one that comes out, or are a diehard fan of One Piece and have to own every piece of merchandise related to the series.